At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
This episode is brought to you by Honda. Introducing the all-new, all-terrain Honda Passport Trail Sport, the most off-road capable Honda Passport Honda has ever dreamt up. The Passport features increased ground clearance, roof rails on all trims, and available specially developed all-terrain tires. And you'll stay comfortable with tri-zone climate control and available features like heated and ventilated front seats and a panoramic moonroof. Learn more at honda.com/passport.
Revolutionize your cooking with the Tefal Infrared Air Fryer. Watch as your food crisps up through a large lighted window and delight in faster, crispier, and juicier results with no preheating, thanks to Tefal's advanced infrared technology. Discover the future of cooking and bring innovation into your kitchen by visiting Tefal.com.
Hello, mega orderers. I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder. I'm recording this right before our first ever live event at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. On this episode, we have a special edition of the podcast for you. We're going to be playing a segment of that live event. We're hoping to host one of these a quarter in Whitehall. If you like what you hear today, please come along to the next one. All you need to do is be a member of our paid Substack or a RUSI member. The details to join either are in the show notes. And for this special inaugural live show, we were joined by all of the Disorder crew. That is to say, it was the first time all of our co-hosts were ever together in person. And then after the four of us chatted, Arthur and I interviewed Neil Melvin, RUSI's Director of International Security. And now to our first ever live show. And this is the first live show of Disorder, a podcast where we try to find a semblance of order in our mad world. So, firstly, in the red, white, and blue corner, representing Virginia, known for her classic Southern drawl, I present to you Alex Hall. Next, in the yellow corner, representing Gloucestershire, I present Arthur Snell. And finally, in the blue and white corner, representing Glasgow,
oh yes,
our returning champion, Jane.
You can't pronounce my surname.
Actually not true.
You can't spell it.
That is true. So, we've never actually even practiced a four-way live panel podcast. So to kick things off, I'd like to try a lightning round. Could each co-host tell us a brief anecdote? How are they experiencing day-to-day this new level of, shall we call it, peak disorder, meaning post-January 2025? I'll go last. Alex?
Okay, thank you. It's great to be here, and thank you all for coming and hearing us out. And hi, all of you. It's nice to see more than just your head on the screen when we do our recordings. So for me, living in Virginia, the most obvious sign of disorder is that the price of eggs in the supermarket have absolutely skyrocketed since Trump was inaugurated. But on a more serious note, my husband heads a non-profit foundation, and he has had to lay off over 90% of his staff and close. He has about 70 worldwide offices, and about 68 of them have been closed. So that is a very visceral impact on my family. Taking it to an even more basic level, at my children's school, they are now giving guidance on what to do if you are an immigrant and whether it is safe for you to go on field trips in case somebody boards the bus and tries to take you into detention, or you come home and your parents are in detention. And you're all seeing the headlines of what's going on, the Ukraine, the Doge, the Elon Musk slashing. What I want to leave you with is it is actually frightening. In the area that I live down the road from the CIA, the Pentagon is not far away, and in my neighborhood, it's a lot of government workers. Dozens of my friends are losing their jobs. I have friends who are thinking about selling their houses, moving their kids to a less expensive college, or moving overseas. And when you run into people in the street and you say, hey, how are you doing? You actually say, how are you doing? And instead of the, oh, I'm good, people say, well, that is what I want to convey. It is very frightening. And eggs have become very expensive.
And it's real. It's not just in the news.
It's real.
And I think what Alex is getting at here is that particularly in the DMV, and that's the tri-state area of DC, Maryland, and Virginia, no one is not impacted in their personal lives. How are you experiencing things, Jane?
Well, it feels a bit more boring to me in my daily life compared to you, Alex, but in a good way. I'm just living in Peckham. Eggs are still quite cheap. At school, we're working on the yearbooks in a friendly way, less drama. But it just shows up for me as trying to navigate being an expert in a time where apparently people are sick of experts and not interested in facts. And so thinking about how you try to communicate with people on policy issues when apparently evidence doesn't exactly cut it.
Arthur.
Well, I think compared to, certainly to Alex, I feel very insulated living as I do in a quiet corner of Gloucestershire. But it's striking how, for me, the last 3 weeks, and maybe I wonder if this resonates with people in this room, has felt like it's sort of 3 months, 6 months, 3 years. I think it's very bad for your health to have a sort of foreign policy crisis that is unfolding in another time zone, because it means you don't sleep very well. And the other thing I've noticed, because I was literally last week trying to finish the first draft of a book on geopolitics, which, big plug here, but it won't come out until next year, which I've just sent to my editor under sort of book on the interaction between contemporary geopolitics and climate change. But it's very, very difficult to write a book at the moment. You can write, obviously, news articles and you can respond to what's happened, but to write something about the changing state of world power, which no one's going to read for a year, and you hope that, of course, people might read it 5 years hence and so on. Now, this is obviously, compared to the challenges that many people are facing, is very small, but I think it illustrates in some ways the extraordinary volatility of the era we're currently living through.
Arthur, you thought it was going to be a current affairs book, and it's actually going to be a history
book.
Well,
that's the issue, yes.
That really resonates with me, Arthur. So much great literature was written during World War I or World War II, but you then ask yourself, was this written in 1916 or in 1915?
Right.
And that reevaluates how you think of the text. And I feel like we're again in one of those eras of acceleration. So, difficult to sleep, difficult to write books. I was never good at either before this crisis, so I admire Arthur that he has been able to achieve those things. How do I experience the disorder? Trends that I had noticed beforehand are now exacerbated. So, for example, I think that things don't work as much in daily life as they used to. You can't get cell phone signal. You can't get the cable company to come to the house. Things that you might think should work, like, I call a lawyer and I engage them. I live, fortunately, both in the US and the UK at the core of Anglo-American civilization, in London and in New York and New Jersey and in DC. Can you get the credit card company to send you your credit card when it's lost or canceled? I feel I have seen over the last 3 or 4 years the basic functions, both of government, like you need them to come and assess your council tax or whatever, and then even the private sector, they work less and less well, and I feel like this is going to be vastly accelerated by the changes that we are now having afoot. So, at Disorder, we try to put forward a unified field theory of what makes the crises in Ukraine and Gaza and elsewhere conceptually similar to similar problems of AI regulation, climate change, things of this nature. I'd like to ask the co-hosts to reach out to this audience that may not all be already Disorder listeners. How would you explain in 1 minute a specific novel feature of our brave new world of geopolitics? And this one I'll go in reverse order. I'll start. And Since 2011, I've experienced international geopolitics as exhibiting two unique features. And I think that Trump 2.0 have put these into hyperdrive. The first one I'll call coordination failure. What do I mean by that? Canada and the US are now in a trade war. Is this best for the Canadian or US economies? No. Are there some things that could have been improved in the Canadian-US relationship? Potentially. But a coordination failure is when I have some interests and you have some interests. We understand that I'm not going to get 99% of mine and you're not going to get 97% of yours. But if we negotiate, maybe I'll get 92% and you'll get 89%. A coordination failure is when I'm like, oh, we're going to cut off all the electricity going from Ontario to the United States. And then we're going to slap auto tariffs. Oh, but no, we're not doing the auto tariffs. We said we were going to. Sorry, I know that you planned. We're just doing these other tariffs. And we end up where I, quote unquote, win the trade war and I get 42% of my interests, and you, quote unquote, lose and you get 30% of your interests. That's a coordination failure. And I've been noticing the acceleration of these kind of coordination failures, and they're not unique to neopopulists. We had them under Obama and Biden. We're having them under Starmer. But I posit that the extent of these coordination failures is a unique feature of our historic era. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is something that is difficult to prove, but I'm going to say it's the rise of the deliberate disorderers. If we look back in time at Mussolini or other horrible dictators, you can think of communists and Pol Pot and whatever, they maybe killed their own people, they repressed the opposition, but they had a vision of order that they wanted in their own society or in their near abroad. I contend that major powers today are deliberately disordering rather than having an alternative order. Again, difficult to prove, but I don't think Trump has a desired end state of what is the ideal trading relationship with Canada. What is it to win vis-a-vis China? I don't think that he has answers. There is no Trumpian order at the end of this confrontation. I see that as quite new. And the Iranians and Putin, to my mind, differ very, very much from the Soviets. It's something that I like saying on the pod because I think it illustrates it so well. Stalin and Khrushchev, they had an order that could be like in a box. It has an economic plan. Read your Marx, read your Lenin. This is the culture that you read. It's translated from Russian. You can imagine it arriving in Cuba. They take it out of the box. It's a fully formed order. Putin doesn't have an order. He maybe wants to crush Ukraine, but he doesn't want it to become a Putinist mini satellite state. There's no version of order that he's trying to export there, and that this is a fundamentally different feature, I would argue, than anything that we've seen in the past 2 centuries of history. Arthur, I'm going in the reverse order. What are your specific features of our historic era?
Well, interestingly, I think because you sort of asked for what are the novel features, and in a way, I'm going to cheat by talking about something which is the opposite of novel, which is actually we're going back in history. And what I mean by that is actually that this sort of return to an age of empires, of a sort of imperialist age. We hear quite a lot of people have been talking in the last few weeks about Yalta, and obviously the reference being, the end of World War II and the great powers dividing up the world. But I don't think that's what it is, because I think that there isn't going to be a moment where Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping sort of agree. I think what you are looking at is a much more chaotic period of global history where a number of great and near great powers behaved as much as possible in an untrammeled fashion. And of course, when we say imperialism, we tend to think of actual territorial empires. Now, of course, some of that is happening. Obviously, Russia is trying to rebuild some of its imperial empire. If you take Trump at his word, he's trying to gain new imperial territories. I think nobody really knows how serious it is, but it's quite striking that the Canadian government appears to take that quite seriously. China, as we all know, has extensive territorial claims. So there is an imperialistic territorial element to this, but there's also a kind of imperialistic behavioural element. So in that sense, maybe it's not novel. We're going back to an age that we can explore and know quite a lot about.
We could call this the back to the future aspect of today's politics. Jane.
I agree with you, Arthur, about the relevance of imperial history, although it comes after decades of small states deciding that that shouldn't be what's accepted anymore. And I always hesitate about saying something's truly novel or unprecedented. I think often when we think something's unprecedented, we just don't know enough about history. But I think what probably is different is the globalised nature of the world, the fact that just the flow of information, people, goods and services around the world is so fast now, and things are so interconnected that the ripple effects from an event in one place to another place are really striking and really fast. And I guess that's particularly what worries me when we look at the possibilities of the US political system going really wrong, when we can actually see as a valid scenario the possibility that the US might stop being a liberal democracy. Then what that means for a world that has been based on a kind of democratic American hegemony is something really unprecedented. I think this might be happening a little bit after the time where everybody followed an agenda set by the US. But we really have to see what happens to things that we might quite like democracy and human rights, if the country that's positioned itself as the champion for those things decides it's fed up with them.
And this is, I guess, the chaos theory butterfly effect aspect, which is that we're all so interconnected, one tiny tweak, or a major tweak in this case, and all the pieces of the mosaic reshift. Alex.
Okay, so actually, I'm just going to pick up something that Jane said about whether it's the end of liberal democracy in America. I reached out to a Republican friend who has very, very good connections in the White House and on the Hill, absolutely connected. And I asked him, will there actually be midterm elections? And I'm pleased to share with you that he said, yes, there will be, that is a limit that we will not sink below. So I just throw that out there. I was quite relieved because everything else he said scared the living daylights out of me, but that was good news. So for me, the disturbing feature of this current world is the fact that there are no agreed set of facts anymore. There are facts and there are alternative facts and there are opinions. There's no common source of trusted information, and experts who might be assumed to know what they're talking about are routinely dissed. And so people can say, I don't believe in climate change, like it's just a sort of philosophy, like some people don't believe in Christianity, and I don't believe in climate change, or I think the measles vaccine causes autism. And so that, for me, is the really troubling feature of our world, and we're all in our own siloed information bubbles.
This has been a selection of the panel discussion with all the Disorder co-hosts and with Arthur, myself, and Neil Melvin. If you're interested in the full discussion, please join the paid Substack. Just as paid Substack members were the only people who could attend the event, only the paid Substack members can hear the full live audio and all the questions, some of which were very funny and involved Lord of the Rings and all of that. So please join the paid Substack to hear the full live audio. After the break, Jane and Alex return to their seats, and Arthur and I continue our conversation with Neil Melvin, RUSI's Director of International Security.
Hey, Fidelity. What's it cost to invest with the Fidelity app?
Start with as little as $1 with no account fees or trade commissions on U.S. stocks and ETFs.
That's music to my ears.
I can only talk.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Zero account fees apply to retail brokerage accounts only. Sell order assessment fee not included. A limited number of ETFs are subject to a transaction-based service fee of $100. See full list at fidelity.com/commissions. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
Switch to Verizon Business and get more from your internet without paying more for your internet. Get LTE Business Internet starting at $39 a month when paired with a Business Unlimited smartphone plan. That's unlimited data, and with it, unlimited possibilities. Start saving today with Verizon Business, ranked #1 in small business internet customer satisfaction by J.D. Power. Starting price for 25 megabits per second internet plan with savings, plus taxes, fees, and economic adjustment charge. Terms apply. For J.D. Power 2024 award information, visit jdpower.com/awards.
Want a website with unmatched power, speed, and control? Try Bluehost Cloud, the new web hosting plan from Bluehost, built for WordPress creators by WordPress experts. With 100% uptime, incredible load times, and 24/7 WordPress priority support, your sites will be lightning fast with global reach. And with Bluehost Cloud, your sites can handle surges in traffic no matter how big. Plus, you automatically get daily backups and world-class security. Get started now at Bluehost.com.
Now I'd like to welcome to the stage Neil Melvin. He's the Director of International Security here at RUSI. His team focuses on understanding geopolitical developments in key regional security areas around the globe, notably Europe and Eurasia, Indo-Pacific, MENA, and identifying how the UK and its allies can best navigate these shifting environments. He spent 35 years working on international security, and he was at the senior level of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, also worked at the EU, the UN, and the Energy Charter. This means you're one of these reviled experts, Neil. So although it's a real pleasure for Arthur and I to get to chat with you, we know that we're in a little bit of a liberal elite expert bubble here, but let's make it count.
Fact-free for you.
Keep it fact-free, yeah.
Very good.
So, Neil, as listeners to the Disorder Pod will know, I am not a believer in what's called IR realism. I am not a realist. I wrote a book about it and countless articles denouncing realism. Realism is not real, just the way that pre-behavioral economics is not real. So on the Disorder Show, I assert that neo-populists attempt to disorder global affairs in their own societies, not to maximize their own interests. And why would they do that? There are psychological considerations, there are coordination failure reasons. And essentially, I can explain this as follows, Before the behavioral turn in economics, people believe that, they're rational actors in economics. I buy this widget because it's better and cheaper. But the answer is lots of people, they buy stocks, they buy the wrong house, they don't maximize their interests. There are behavioral reasons at play here. So debate this with me. Is Trump doing in certain ways a long overdue strategic shift in American interests where he's actually trying to maximize American interests? Or is he entirely missing the boat and selfishly doing things that he likes that are not beneficial for American interests? Where do you stand on this debate, and can you give us examples of the one and of the other?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks. It's great to be on the podcast. I mean, we're all caught in the sort of the headlights of the Trump juggernaut at the moment, and the blizzard of tweets and flip-flopping on policy and so on. And so I think in that context, it may be hard to argue that there's a rationality, but I think if you try and pull back a little bit, if we imagine that we're the historians of the future looking at this period, then clearly I think what we're going to see that this isn't a straight line. There's zigzagging. But underpinning it, there are certain patterns emerging, and the fundamental pattern is about the US repositioning itself as a global actor. And it's doing that in different timeframes and with different administrations. When I started my career, as you said, you revealed 35 years ago, it was a long time, I started on European security. And the idea was that European security was Vancouver to Vladivostok. In my career, that space has collapsed, and we're now down to the eastern flank of NATO. We lost Russia, of course. We've lost Central Asia. South Caucasus has exited European security with barely a squeak. We saw this with Georgia recently. So there is something happening that's not just about Trump, and I think we need to look at that. And my interpretation of that is that in the post-war period, post-World War II period, we saw the US construct an international order together with the UK focused on the Euro-Atlantic space and the Euro-Atlantic institutions. This was the center of the global struggle with the Soviet Union. NATO, the EU are the product of that. and the world order in a way pivoted around that. That is no longer the case. Europe is not the global center either for economics or for security. And so the US has begun to move away from that. And I think you could even say, but 2008, when Russia drew the line in the Russia-Georgia war, there was no military response. That was the moment that the US said, we are not going to extend our security any further than the eastern flank. So although we're pointing at Trump and saying, well, why aren't you coming to Ukraine's aid? This has been the US position since 2008, actually, although the door has been open for NATO membership in theory for Ukraine and Georgia. The US has said we are now going no further because our interests are moving beyond Europe and we have to look sort of outside that. And so I think, Trump, he's obviously sui generis. He's doing a lot of crazy things, frankly, himself, and this will be some of the tic-tacking. But there is also a certain logic, I think, underpinning some of the things that he's doing that reflects that US view.
If I could sum up this point, it's the idea that there's a pivot to Asia, which has been taking multi-decade to happen, right? Obama was pivoting to Asia, so to speak. Biden has talked about the pivot to Asia. So threatening Europe, saying we're not going to defend you, you've got to spend more, is part of a longer historical durée pivot to Asia. Okay, I can kind of buy that. But let's look at these first 6 weeks. What has he done that has actually realigned how Trumpian America is securing its interests in Asia? And then if the U.S. has to rebuild its global role, play me a thought experiment. It's 5 to 10 years hence. Vance or Josh Hawley is in power. They're ruling the roost. What is their grand strategic vision, and how have these actions gotten towards them?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the first 6 weeks, it feels like a lifetime already, but I mean, we've already gone through the collapse of US position in Europe, the Gaza, the East Mediterranean Riviera, and a whole set of other positions. So it's hard to see that, as I say, the Trump period has achieved much in that rational sense. My own sense is that probably this may be the peak Trump in a way. I mean, there hasn't been much pushback yet. I do think the US system will right itself. I mean, there will be mechanism, there will be an opposition that will emerge. We've already seen the markets doing that. I think arguably you could say that there has been some things that he's achieved, which is he has got the Europeans, after 20 years, actually talking realistically about spending on defense. And it's a terrible thing that actually it's taken this chaos and this panic, frankly, in Europe to get us there. It wasn't as though Trump was the first US president to say this. They've been saying it repeatedly, but there's been no movement on the European side. So perhaps it's also a reflection on the Europeans to some degree that it's taken Trump to actually get us to move the dial. I mean, why was it that we couldn't respond before that? Frankly, even when the Ukraine war began, the dial moved only a little bit. It's only really been these 6 weeks where suddenly Europeans have started talking about the need to get serious about defense.
And what underlies this point is that he was ahead in the polls for 6 or 7 months before, and yet they didn't prepare. And then it's like, oh my God, we didn't see this coming. In other words, it's taken this degree of an obvious crisis, it's taken it to actually happen.
Well, there's all these discussions about Trump-proofing Europe. I mean,
but nothing happened.
Well done. That's really worked out well, one has to say. And the Trump whisperers, where are they? They had that twofold strategy of proofing and whispering, and now we're sort of where we are.
So before kicking it over to Arthur, I just want to say, okay, so if there is a genuine quote-unquote strategy and strategic pivot here, what new skills is Trumpian America developing in the domains of cyber, AI, the technology race with China, all of these other things? Because the conventional way of looking at the global struggle may no longer apply, and Trump is supposed to have all these tech geniuses that are around him. Can we see anything actually happening there?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very early in the Trump administration to see whether there's anything concretely coming through. He's announced, of course, this huge investment in AI. Let's see if we can deliver that. But, I mean, I think if we roll back a couple of years, you can see that coming through the US system is a revolution in many of these areas. And part of the US reordering has also been around new technology, the AUKUS strategic alliance, which often it's entered into around providing nuclear submarines to Australia, actually it's really a 50-year technology alliance against a possible threat from China. So it's a punt on the future that the Biden administration took on the assumption that we'd have to develop new technologies together in areas like quantum, in cyber, in hypersonic missiles, so all these new technologies. So I think the US, that is coming through the US system, and it is driving it. And this really goes, I think, to the core question for the US ultimately, and we haven't really touched on it yet, but what is their position going to be on China? We had a reasonably clear position under the Biden administration. This is something that the Trump team haven't yet got to. Despite all these other things that we've had, I think the core question of their administration is going to be, what are they going to do on China? And we don't yet know. There's two tracks. I mean, Trump clearly wants to do a deal, as he does with everybody. He thinks he can do a deal with Xi that will end up actually in almost like he becomes almost a peacenik when he talks about this. He wants to disarm the world, cut back nuclear weapons by 50%, cut the defense budget in some kind of John Lennon sort of moment. But then there's another kind of a hardcore group, I think, around him who've come in, who the Asia First people, who are often not confirmed yet, who see China as a core strategic threat to the US. And so technology is going to be one of the main areas that this is going to be fought out. Now, will it be that there's a deal, or will it become more of a confrontation? This is the key thing to look for in the next year or two of the Trump team.
And amidst this increasing, I think, U.S.-China showdown, whether it's precipitated by tariffs or by other geopolitical events, we need to ask, what is the role of Europe in all of this? I will kick it over to you, Arthur, to try to guide us through ways of looking at that.
Yeah, well, Neil, I definitely want to talk about Europe, but I reckon before we do that, let's touch on the crinks. So China, Russia, India, North Korea. It sounds like a sort of cartoon, doesn't it? But you talk there about China. But is this a group that in some way is acting in concert? Because you could argue, of course, the war in Ukraine is a war against that grouping, whether it's North Korean troops, Iranian drones, Chinese materials, and so on. So how are you sort of looking at that grouping? And
I mean, it's not really a sort of gang that meets, clandestinely and tries to rule the world, I would say. It's more like a set of overlapping bilateral relationships, which doesn't sort of, form a coherent organization. But they do have a coherent set of interests in certain areas. And one of those, of course, is pushing back against the US-led global order and promoting a multipolar world in which they all feel they would then have a leading role, either as a global actor or as a regional actor in, say, the case of Iran or North Korea. And the war in Ukraine has accelerated that cooperation. So there is, again, I think when you push into some aspects of what Trump says, there is a kernel of truth. This idea they want to stop the war because actually it is promoting cooperation. That cooperation has come together. The Iran-Russia strategic partnership that was signed recently is a product of the Ukraine war. The Russia-North Korea agreement is a product of the Ukraine war. So the war has been an accelerator of those. And so ending the war may shift that. But it's also, I think, feeding into some other aspects, which is that they're trying to create an alternative order to some degree around things like the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And underpinning this is actually a bigger project, which is to make Eurasia the global pivot of the world. They want to link up their own projects and to challenge what was the victory of the Euro-Atlantic community, which is to control the maritime space. This is what underpins deep down, as we to peel back the onion of disorder, is a struggle between maritime powers and land-based Eurasian powers.
Is there a way in which it seems that Trump wants a multipolar world? And because interestingly, he clearly sees some kind of, he sees that in a future world, the US and Russia can work very well together. I mean, I think we can't sort of deny that. Whereas, as you've already illustrated, with China, it's less clear, and there may be a sort of ultra-hawkish approach, or there may be a more kind of, transactional one.
Yeah. No, I think he shares a view, and we haven't touched on it much yet, I think, but I mean, one thing I think that's happening is that you are seeing the re-emergence of the nation state as the core actor in international affairs. And this is what Trump is grasping. So for him, it's not about GDP. So he can go to war with Canada, which is clearly on trade, which is clearly irrational, I think, from a liberal perspective, because it's going to be suboptimal outcomes. Both countries are going to lose. But if he comes out and he's the victor, and there's a kind of status issue in that, I think he's measuring his success in those terms. So I think and when he looks at Europe and multilateral frameworks, there's no deal to be done with those kind of things. He can do a deal with Russia, and he can try and get ahead. I think someone mentioned about how he often thinks of the world in terms of subcontractors, about whether he can, well, frankly, screw them or get a better deal.
Yeah.
So I think he can see that with Russia, with Turkey, with China, with Saudi Arabia, with India, those are countries where he can do a deal where he can maybe come out ahead and sort of get more status and prestige. Some complicated multilateral agreement that may put 0.2% of GDP over 10 years, that's not a victory that kind of a national politician can really sort of cling to, I think, in his framework.
Yeah, and I suppose, and that takes us to Europe. And obviously, one of the things, just perhaps to illustrate this, is that neither Ursula von der Leyen or Kaja Kallas, have managed to have any sort of high-level engagement as yet. And clearly, Trump doesn't want to deal. And as you say, they prefer bilateralism. But what is Europe's appropriate response? I mean, I think you said that Europe needs to become sort of genuine security partners of the United States. But it's not clear to me the United States wants genuine security partners or partnerships from Europe.
Well, this is the challenge now, as I see it, for Europe, which is that we have to decide what we want and present that to the US. I mean, at the moment, we're at the stage where we think defense spending, increasing that's going to be enough.
Yeah.
And that's just, I think, the chips to get onto the table, frankly. The question is then, what are we going to do with that? And what is our policy on Russia? Okay, we're going to increase defense to 3%, but then, do we have a strategy on Russia? Do we have a European approach to the Middle East? Do we have a European approach to China? I think unless we can actually identify what is our security interest and how we're going to deploy political and military strategies around that, the US is not going to see us in Europe as a real partner. Maybe we can look after our affairs in Europe while they pivot away to do other things. But that, to me, is the biggest challenge now for Europe, is can we find the way to work in some way to assert that role. And at the moment, I don't see that. I mean, there's steps forward, but I think we're very far from that conversation, which is why Europe is frankly missing from the Middle East. I mean, we're still the payer, not the player. Now the Gaza war is coming to an end. Of course, we're starting to say we can have a position on reconstructing Gaza, but the politics has been decided without us.
Here we are, the Disorder podcast, and what we try to do is order the disorder. So let's, the three of us, try and sort of think of some things that we can carry forwards and not only talk about the disorder.
Yeah, we are excited about this partnership with RUSI because we want to be working on things that are implementable, actionable, and that the UK and Europe can do. So you have a lot of experience in the security space. Imagine you were stuck in an elevator ride with Defense Secretary John Healey, and it was, say, 3 weeks after the failure of the meetings that are happening in Saudi now. There's no peace agreement. There's no end in sight. You've got him for the whole elevator ride, but it is only going to last about 45 seconds. What would you advise him to do?
Actually, this is a great link to RUSI, because there is a famous moment in RUSI's history where Henry Kissinger, John Major, and one of our RUSI fellows got stuck in our very tiny little lift. So this is not too far from...
World history has never been the same.
Exactly.
Since, yeah.
A lot of things were decided in that lift, I can say. But, first of all, I tell him not to pre-plan any holidays, because I think his job is going to be about handling unpredictable crisis non-stop. But I think, first of all, we need to stay close to the US. It's going to be very difficult, but the reality is, because of the centrality of the US, we need to find a way to keep the partnership going with the US, including, I think, around this global restructuring, because the US is going to lead that, and the UK-US partnership has been a very powerful one.
So that's certainly what Starmer and Healey think that their role is. If you listen to what they say, we're a bridge between the EU and the US. And, Starmer did the best in his Oval Office visits. He did much better than Macron and obviously than Zelensky. And Healey apparently gets on great with Hegseth. They're like bros and they chat and whatever. I don't think that's the answer. I'm really happy to put on my goal hanger hat and disagree agreeably with you. I think that is a very excellent articulation of one thing they could do, but probably that is, to my mind, the wrong answer. To my mind, the right answer is this is Starmer's moment. He should have been the mega orderer-in-chief from July 5th, 2024 until now, but he gets a second chance. Just like Trudeau got a chance and Carney is now stepping into his moment, Starmer should be convening the mega ordering conference here, where the defense commitments are made here, where they talk about, we're not good at radar jamming. We need the Americans for that. Guess what? In the Silicon Fens, we've just spent 90 bazillion to make the radar jamming factory. And it can't be a moment too soon. So it's all well and good that he's having these meetings in Paris and Healey is going there in Paris and whatever. I just want to see them not play the traditional Anglo-American role and to step in and say, we have more core equities with the Gulf players who are going to be funding this stuff. We have more core equities with the tech players than, for example, the French and the Spanish. And you know what? The Germans are good at this, but they don't have embassies in all these countries. We're the ones who have that. We have the nukes. We're the pen holder on this issue with the UN. So I hope we can agree to disagree on this topic.
Absolutely not. I think you're totally wrong, I have to say. I mean, to not understand the power of the US and the security relationship that we depend on with the US, and that we could suddenly swap that for some fictitious relationship with the Gulf countries, I think that is not a starting point for really going forward. I agree it's going to be difficult, but I think there's really no alternative but to trying to find a way to stay with the US for core security interests, and because I believe that the US will actually emerge at some point from this situation, and we need to be the friend that is there even in the difficult times of the US. But that doesn't mean to say that point two, I would say, is also we have to look to Europe. But I think we also have to be realistic on the European side. Is that Europe is probably going to go through a very disruptive period in the next few years because this nation-state tendency I spoke about, I think is going to come to Europe too. You see it already. I mean, rearmament is not happening at the EU level. It's happening through the states. So states are emerging as the key actors on the European security side. Germany will be rearming as Germany, not through EU mechanisms. So I think we have to think, how can we manage a Europe that is also going to change while staying close to it? And here I think you're right, the UK probably does have a role. And one of the things I think we need to think about is new institutions. Is now the moment for, say, a European Security Council that would try to bring together the most powerful European states but not exclude the middle and smaller countries, which has traditionally, of course, been the problem of European security, of the big powers picking off the smaller ones. So we need to find a way of doing that. The EU does not really embrace that, and without US engagement, NATO is going to struggle. So I think we need to be a bit creative now, and this may be a moment to do that.
So my pushback before tossing to Arthur is that in any healthy marriage or relationship, the two parties have to be independent, and Europe and the UK have been for too long dependent on the American security umbrella. Now is the moment to strike out and develop these independent ordering capacities. And then when the relationship resets under the Buttigieg administration, it will be the UK and Europe's ability to bring more to the table, and the marriage will be healthier. So of course the US is the 9,000-pound gorilla in the room, and of course the UK will have a closer relationship with it than any of the other core European countries, although Ireland will, of course, have a very special relationship with the US. But if you want that relationship to be better, now is the time for Starmer to step up and be like, I'm the one running the G7 now. I'm the one who's the leader of the free world. When Carney and I get together, that's the free world. And I just want to push back against this conventional thinking, even from a rhetorical perspective, because we understand the realities at play, but part of ordering the disorder is going beyond that conventional way of thinking.
Let's go more conventional anyway, and a sort of classic RUSI question, which is obviously in one of the things that's happened in the last couple of weeks is the UK raising by a very small amount its own defence spending, and 2.5%, we're hardly going to be celebrating in the streets around that. But as we all know, and people in this room will know better than most, that the UK Armed Forces, even if you add that money, are unbelievably stretched, overstretched, under-resourced. So what is a good thing to do? Should we mothball the carriers, for example? What would be a good thing to do to radically change the way that our armed forces can operate in support of European security?
Yeah, well, this is going to be one of the tough questions for Europeans, ultimately, is where's the money going to come from?
Yeah.
I don't think mothballing the carriers would help. They're a good capability. What we need to do is accelerate our rearmament and go to 3% actually much quicker. And of course, that is going to involve tough questions because probably it's going to have to come from social security and other budgets. So you're going to have a complete sort of political resettlement across Europe. It's starting to happen. You can see it not just in the UK, but Scandinavian countries are moving money from their social security budgets, from the hospitals and so on. But it's this is a core political issue. So that, I think, is step one, is we have to have a realistic conversation about how we can use money to rearm faster. And things like the carriers, if we're talking about a UK role, actually the carriers are fantastic because what they do is they magnify UK power because other countries come in with the UK onto the carriers. You can have Italian F-35B planes flying off British carriers. You can have Norwegian frigates protecting British carriers. So it actually is the way to work with others in framework concept, which is really what the UK does, actually. That is, I think, the strength. And sort of coming back to what you're asking about the UK, I think the UK does have a lot to bring. We have to be realistic about that. But I think the convening power, including through the British military, is a way to magnify that. And now is the right moment to start those kind of conversations about how we can build sort of flexilateralism, coalitions of the willing, whatever it is, to try to bring that forward.
We love on the Disorder program to always ask our expert guests, if you were king for a day and you could create one global institution that would order the disorder in the security domain, because we're here at RUSI, what is this institution that you would create and how would it function?
Yeah. I think that this European Security Council, to me, is what we need to do, because one of the biggest risks for Europe is actually that we don't just sort of rise out of the ashes of the Euro-Atlantic order, but we actually just splinter. And you can already begin to see this happening, is that once the US presence desecuritized our bilateral relations, that was the biggest gift of the US. We didn't have to worry anymore about each other. We could cooperate. Once the US lifts, all the old potential risks around who's the biggest power in Europe, which gangs are going to be with which big power reemerges. And so I think that if Europe is to start to kind of reorder the disorder, it's going to have to get its act together at home first. And that's going to be about finding ways to work together in this new context.
That's excellent. That echoes a lot of what we've heard of many guests over our now 105 episodes. So allow me to say that is surely more than enough from me. It has been great hearing from you, Neil.
Thanks.
We would love to take listener questions in the room, be they about the global enduring disorder in general, anything the panel has said, or specifically the title of the event, Europe's Role in the Battle for an Orderly World. The floor is now yours, and our returning champions, Jane and Alex, can rejoin us on the stage.
George Close, mega orderer. I'm a lawyer. I recently returned from New Zealand, so I'm in the habit of doing lots of Lord of the Rings analogies. I wonder, as Trump aligns himself closer to Putin, perhaps a bit like Saruman and Sauron, to what extent can Mark Carney be, which I would argue his maybe unique blend of intellect, media charisma, and perhaps actually leverage, to be Europe's Gandalf the White as Zelensky, our King Theoden, has been held up in Helm's Deep with, perhaps on what you were saying, Jason, Sir Keir Starmer, Aragorn, son of a toolmaker. I thought of that during this thing, and I was so proud of that, by the way. And I appreciate he's got to win a general election, but I wonder, I guess, can Mark Carney be Europe's Gandalf the White?
Yeah, well, so I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. So I'm going to come in on this. I think we have a potential fellowship of the ring, and maybe Carney is Legolas, the elf. Right. What we don't have is a Lord of the Rings yet. And this is the problem, is that the rest of the West, the Europeans, the Canada, the sort of democracies, South Korea, and we don't have one single leader. That is our challenge, is who is going to step up and be that leader. So we have lots of people who are willing to be part of the fellowship, but not the individual leader, and that's the challenge we have.
And that leads to coordination complexities. Here's how I'm going to sum up what I've learned today. I think it's really great to disagree agreeably, and the question for Europe is they really do need America economically and in terms of security. Trump isn't going to live forever, whether or not he wants to stay in power forever. How do they maintain those relationships while building their own independent capacities? And I would argue it's to create a club of orderers to push back against the disorderers. That is my analysis. And I hope that you have all enjoyed getting some more order out of this with me today. Thank you. Thanks for listening to the first ever live event of the Disorder Podcast. As we said, the only way that you can attend this kind of live show in person is either as a RUSI member or a paid-up Substack subscriber. And we're going to be trying to do more live events like at the Frontline Club, maybe in DC and in New York, and around the UK, like in Oxford. We're going to be doing these things whenever we can get amazing guests like Sir Bill Browder, or, as we did today, Neil Melvin. So make sure that you can follow the links in the show notes, join the Substack, and come along next time. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the mega orderer-in-chief, George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. I am wishing you, as always, an orderly week.
The political landscape has changed.
The country is changing direction. It's a big moment and a very, very difficult one.
The New Statesman podcast is here to help you understand what's really going on in Westminster and beyond.
I think there's a sense in Downing Street that this is the vision, this is the narrative, this is the plan.
I'm Hannah Barnes. Join me, Andrew Marr, the New Statesman's politics team and political guests every Thursday and Friday. Search The New Statesman in your podcast app now.
Hi there, I'm Al Murray, co-host of We Have Ways of Making You Talk, the world's premier Second World War history podcast from Goalhanger.
And I'm James Holland, best-selling World War II historian, and together we tell the best stories from the war. This time, we're doing a deep dive into the last major attack by the Nazis on the West, the Battle of the Bulge.
And what's so fascinating about this story is we've been able to show how quite a lot of the popular history about this battle is kind of the wrong way round, isn't it, Jim? The whole thing is a disaster from the start. Even Hitler's plans for the attack are insane and divorced from reality.
Well, you're so right, but what we can do is celebrate this as an American success story for the ages. From their generals at the top to the GIs on the front line, full of gumption and grit, the Bulge should be remembered as a great victory for the USA.
And if this sounds good to you, we've got a short taste for you here. Search We Have Ways wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks.
Yeah. Anyway, so who is Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper?
But I see his jaunty hat and I just think...
and his SS skull and crossbones.
Well, I see his reputation and I think, well, you know, you might be a handsome devil, but the emphasis is on the devil bit rather than the handsome.
Yeah. Anyway, be that as may, he's 29 years old, and he's got a very interesting career, really, because he comes from a pretty right-wing family. Let's face it. He's joined the SS at a pretty early stage. He's very into National Socialism. He's also been Himmler's adjutant.
Yeah,
he took a little bit of time off in the summer of 1940 to go and fight with the first Waffen-SS Panzer Division.
Yeah.
Did pretty well, went back to being Himmler's adjutant, then went off and commanded troops in the Eastern Front, rose up to be a pretty young regimental commander. I mean, there's not many people that age are an Obersturmbannführer, which is sort of colonel.
Yes, you see, what must it have been like if Himmler's adjutant turns up and he's been posted to you as an officer? Do you think, well, he only got that job because of his connections? For Piper, it must have been he's always having to prove himself, surely, because he has turned up. He's not worked his way through the ranks of the Waffen-SS. He's dolloped in, having come from head office, as it were. It must be a peculiar position to be in, right? Yeah. He's got lots to prove, right? That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and he's from a sort of middle-class background as well.
Yeah.
But he's got an older brother who's had mental illness and attempted suicide and never really recovers, and actually has died of TB eventually in 1942. Gosh. He's got a younger brother called Horst, who's also joined the SS and Toten Kopfverbande and died in a never really properly explained accident in Poland in 1941.
Right.
Piper gains a sort of growing reputation on the Eastern Front for being kind of very inspiring, fearless, obviously courageous, all the guys love him, all that kind of stuff. But he's also orders the destruction of the entire village of Krasnaya Polyana in a kind of revenge killing by Russian partisans.
Yeah.
And his unit becomes known as the Blowtorch Battalion because of his penchant for torching Russian villages. So he's got all the gongs. He's got Iron Cross, Second Class, First Class, Cross of Gold, Knight's Cross. Did very well at Kursk. Briefly in northern Italy, actually. Then in Ukraine. Then in Normandy, he suffers a nervous breakdown.
Yeah.
And he's relieved of his command on the 2nd of August. And he's hospitalised from September to October. So he's not in command during Operation Lutich. And then he rejoins 1st SS Panzer Regiment as its commander again in October 1944. It's really, really odd. I mean...
But isn't that interesting, though? Because if you're a Lancer, if you're an ordinary soldier, you're not allowed to have a nervous breakdown. You don't get hospitalised. You don't get time off. How you could interpret this is a sort of Nazi princeling, isn't he? Is Himmler's adjutant. He's demonstrated the necessary Nazi zeal on the Eastern Front and all this sort of stuff. It comes to Normandy where they're losing. Why else would he have a nervous breakdown? He's shown all the zeal and application in the Nazi manner up to this point, and they're losing, And because he's a knob, because he's well connected, he gets to be hospitalised if he has a nervous breakdown. He isn't told, like an ordinary German soldier, there's no such thing as combat fatigue, mate. Go back to work.
Yes, and it's a nervous breakdown, not combat fatigue.
Well, yes, of course.
But
what's the
one
difference?
SS soldier said of him, Piper was the most dynamic man I ever met. He just got things done.
Yeah.
You get this image I have of him of having this kind of sort of slightly manic energy.
Yeah.
He's virulently National Socialist. He's got this great reputation. He's damned if anyone's going to tarnish it. He's a driver, all those things.
He's trying to make the will triumph, isn't he? He's working towards the Führer. He's imbued with, he knows what's expected of him, extreme violence and cruelty and pushing his men on. I mean, he's the Führer principle writ large, isn't he, as an SS officer? Which is why cruelty and extreme violence are bundled in to wherever he goes, basically.